Hi, thank you guys for a lovely session and congratulations on the book. You touched on Zimbabwe. Just a quick one there. Just maybe your views on. Well, I was born in Zimbabwe, in Bulawayo. I've been in South Africa for quite a while. My father's from here. It's a different story. We all want something different, I believe. Maybe just your views on what could possibly happen and maybe what you have seen and maybe sensed from a female perspective.
Thank you. Is there another question? Maybe we'll take, do you want them in a couple of batches, Jessica? Is that okay? Yeah. Another question, statement, and I think there's a mic there.
I feel thoroughly inspired. Thank you so much for that session. I was thinking as you were, and congratulations on the book, I was thinking as you were talking and talking us through the themes, I wonder what didn't make the cut. But my question is around religion. How much did you see evidence of that from the African perspective as either inhibiting or enabling feminism? And I know that's quite broad, but were there any sort of diverging views on that? So.
One more. See a hand here. I'm sorry if I'm not seeing you. It's literally the lights are a bit blinding here.
Thank you so much for the book. I think the thing for me, especially as a young woman in the political space, I want to know how pivotal rebelling is. You know, when Angela Davis speaks about how important it is for women to win victories, it's virtually essential for every segment in society. I just want you to give me a perspective and as to what is it really that women in leadership need to do in order for us to see ourselves more defined, especially in more masculine-centered spaces.
Thank you so much for the questions. On the finer details of Zim, it's hard to say. I mean, I think I'm not an expert by any means on that question. But I think what I'm raising in the book about the nation is exactly the kinds of questions I think are at hand. You know, because it's like, for whom? You know? And how is that done? And the fundamental questions that are framing the politics on land and what have you will always be deeply gendered. You know, and unfortunately, again, that was a liberation process that created that nation where women were really were foundational as well, right? Were as active as men. And so I think there will always be a question of like, why is that not part then of the national effort, right? A national conversation in the way it needs to be. So to me, that's the thing. I just feel like, you know, this whole world, because I mean, I think, you know, we can look at the African continent and be stressed out about formal governance, but then you look at the rest of the world, you know, there's not, I mean, like, really, like, name one country, do you know what I mean, that's inspiring, you know, like, and so it's not our problem alone, you know what I mean, it's like a collective crisis we have around the choices of models that we've, that we've chosen to structure this world are just failing. And so to me, I would just say whatever the conversations are, they have to include these questions on gender justice, because otherwise it's always going to be a half win, you know. In terms of what didn't make it, I mean, I wanted to go more into the digital and like as a terrain that's really important in contemporary times. I touch on it a little bit, but to be honest, I felt I started to write because I wanted to write about the 20 years that I had been engaged. But then everything has a history, you know, so I started kind of researching more of the history and including that. And then I ran out of words, basically, because I had a word limit. But there's also the Chennais and other people here who are experts in the digital space. And, you know, to me, it's just, like I said, it's polyphonic, right? So it's just like we're in conversation and everybody's adding to this process of thinking. So to me, I'm looking forward to reading also people who are deeply involved in this space. But it is interesting. Actually, African feminists have done a lot in the digital terrain that I think is worthy of note and thought, and particularly because that is also an important dimension. And also the sisters in Congo that I speak about, who are also here on my kimono, are also suffering because they're basically sitting on, right, the soil that they are heir to is also the soil that is home to critical minerals, right? for AI and whatever. And so, these things are actually important, not just in terms of the actual technology we use, but all of the kind of ecosystem around it. On religion, I do have a space in there called In the Spirit, thinking about that, and I talk about it as being one of the more awkward spaces of African feminist praxis, because a lot of people have deeply held personal religious beliefs in mainstream religion. And actually I think like it's an area that needs more thought. But we're also, there's a range of spiritual practice on this continent, and I feel like to only ever narrow everything down to Christianity and, if you're lucky, Islam is too narrow. There's such a massive diversity of engagement. My personal belief is that people are entitled to their spiritual practices and their spiritual beliefs. But that all spiritual practices and beliefs have the potential to be liberatory. It just depends on how you read it. So you can read into any text or any guidance or any kind of theology or any practice oppression and justifying oppression, or you can justify freedom through it. And so to me, that's the question more than which particular thing do you practice. It's more like, and with it, what are you doing? Is it offering love? Is it engaging, divine energies as a resource for transformation for everybody? What are you doing? Or is it the justification of oppression of others? What are you doing with it? So to me, that's where I think it's important. But I do speak to it a little bit. Rebelling and leadership. It's tricky. Like I said before, what's tricky, the ungovernability is the rebelling. What's difficult is, the definition of institutions is orthodoxy. The institution is constituted by norms. And so if you come in and disobey the norms, there's punishment, right? And so all of the institutions that govern our lives are built on patriarchal principles. And then if you race as well, ableist, generally homophobic, is that right? Like that, those are the institutions that govern our lives, and that's the problem. So, yes, we do go into these institutions and attempt to lead. However, with what mandate, right? Because the normative structure of the institution gives us no mandate. We actually have no power in the way that the institution is constituted at depth, and that's what we keep hitting up against. And people talk about critical mass and needing enough to be able to shift and all of that. I would say, like, if you're in the middle of it, you need allies, you need comrades, you can't lead. There's no leading alone anyway. But like in that kind of thing, you need to have people with you who are also actively defending you. A friend of mine in the States just wrote this book, Unrig the Game, about women of color and leadership, and she has these mantras, and one of them is, may I be surrounded by people with backbone. Oh no. May I be surrounded by people with backbone. So, it's tough, but like I said, to me, it's all part of the ecosystem of change. That's how I see it, and some people, get to a point where, or it's in their character to be in the ungovernable, kind of terrain of interaction. Other people have a taste for more institutional forms. To me, I see it as an ecosystem. I think all of them are valuable contributions. Different times, different things are needed, and sometimes we are being a little bit unbrave, and could maybe push it a bit more. But at the same time, like I said, it's tough. I've been, in that situation a couple times of, having quite serious responsibility technically in an institution. And like I said, you need community around you, but also to stay grounded. You have to remember your why and why you're there, and that the institution does not define your value. So you link to the reason you're there, and that is your value. You're there to contribute to your people, yeah? And you remember that. And what the institution does with that is not always in your control. okay? But you acknowledge that for yourself, and your reference point of how well you're doing has to be the people that you love. Are you advancing, right, their dreams? You know, you stay connected to that, and that to me is the way that you navigate. But like I said, you need comrades. Yeah, you just need, yeah, and to also know that we appreciate you. You know, everybody that tries, everybody that's in there trying to do it, we appreciate it. We know we need it. You know, and my view is, like I said, all of it is a contribution. You know, to the transformation.
So I'd like to then let's dig back a bit into the piece on pleasure, Jessica, because why not? And really talk a bit more around the politics of pleasure, the meaning of pleasure, the practice of pleasure, and maybe delink it. It's hard to delink it from the notion of care. It's also hard to delink it from the notion of resistance. The resistance to the mundane, the resistance to the normal, the resistance to the pedestrian. And that we can take pleasure in many things. I'm taking pleasure in this kimono because it's speaking, it's evoking, it's embodying as well. It's an act of activism. That's bad grammar. Anyway, kishoa doesn't matter. It's activism, but it is also beauty. It is also insurrection. It's a statement. It's fashion. It is style. It's many things. So pleasure takes many forms. So perhaps we can dig into that a bit.
No, thank you. And again, I think this is one of the terrains where in pleasure is where we embody the freedom we seek, you know, where we're able to actually experience that joy and what it means to live free, right? Accessing pleasure is where we find that. I actually quote Kwesi Mambandaza about speaking about aesthetics and how in the 1 in 9 campaign it was actually very important to integrate that into the way that they organized, you know, as much as they were dealing with very heavy issues, to always integrate that, you know. And so to me, again, I think it's also something, I mean, in my mother's culture in Western Uganda and Toro, like there's this real deep appreciation for the beautiful, you know. And I think it's something shared, you know, the deep appreciation for the beautiful. And it's not in the sense of glamour, you know what I mean? But it's just this thing, huh? It's this thing we do. And I feel like that's something across the continent that's there. And so to me, it's a kind of deep connection to what it means to be fully alive, and like I said, what it means to manifest freedom, to engage the pleasurable in all these forms. I of course speak about embodied pleasure and sexual pleasure because I say how, in a way, violation has almost become a pleasure in patriarchy, right? And violation is a pleasure. It's something you laugh about. It's a joke. It's something you sing about, and you know, talk about conquests and all the things you do. And right, it's supposed to be we're supposed to dance. You know, why you say all these horrible things about us, right? The violation is a pleasure in patriarchy, and so how we then reclaim in the feminisms is to just define a completely different terrain, right? Of what the pleasure is. And so I talk about all different kinds of pleasure praxis. And again, how, you know, like I said, the pleasure at the umtsu level can be there, but it can never be without the structural conditions for it. So that, you know, people live without the possibility of certain kinds of aesthetics in their lives, the ugliness of the way, you know, that economically marginalized communities are designed, the types of houses people are shoved into, right? The lack of light, no plants. Do you know what I mean? Like the lack of ability to even customize your own space and house and paint to do the things you do, right? So in reclaiming the pleasure, we have to feel it in ourselves, but we also then have to work again for the transformation of conditions so that everybody has access to that. You know what I mean? Everybody has access to it. And so to me, that the pleasure is political in that respect, that it's structural. It's also a terrain of struggle, you know. But I think the cool thing, and like what I love about African feminisms, is this willingness to engage this and to integrate it into different ways. I speak about Hope Chigudu, who does a lot of work in the domain of care praxis, but you know, she'll always like she'll facilitate a workshop, and she'll make these, you know, altars full of fruit and like just all these lovely things, you know. So you like walk into this room and there's just all of these unusual things, you know, that are there that just are nourishing. And to me, it's all of that. It's just trying to conjure and to create space and for people to be able to experience even small acts and small moments, you know, of the pleasure of being free. Yeah.
And you name it as voluptuous, which I think is a wonderful word. This universe of pleasure rituals and tools traces its voluptuous presence across the African continent. And what you're saying about the pleasure in self-defining one's living space is also linked to the way the state has decided what is and is not humanity and personhood. So when I was driving here today, I passed several informal settlements, and many of them had satellite dishes, right? And I was remembering, you know, one of the things that you hear, which is those people, right? They can even afford to have a satellite dish. And it's this strange, perverse logic. You're not poor because you got a satellite, because you're watching DSTV. You know, because you're watching the news and you're watching a couple of soapies. You're poor because of a failure of intergenerational and structural and systemic violences that are racialized, that come from coloniality, that come from, you know, extractivism of labor, that come from being at a certain end of the value chain, or the chain of devaluation, as I often call it. It's got nothing to do with the satellite dish. It's got nothing to do with, oh, they do their hair. As though poverty should and indigence should present itself. You must be destroyed. You must be prostrated in front of white capitalism to be deemed as the deserving poor. And this is, I think, you know, when we speak about pleasure as a reproach on that, and feminism as really standing against that, and a reclamation of personhood. And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, whereas as women, you're not entitled to your personhood because you are poor. You are indigent. How dare you still be beautiful? How dare your hair be neat? How dare your edges be snatched? Like, for what? Right? For what?
The edges. I mean, and you see, listen, ignore my edges. But it's interesting because you see the development narrative, which is unfortunately governs many of us and governs, again, even the economic models and the way, whether or not we get resources and whatnot for things, is framed in this idea. It's like this really narrow idea about what is the indicators of aliveness, you know? What are the indicators of aliveness? And that also, you know, when you're poor, you must diligently work to feed your family and pay school fees, and those have to be in your priority, like your primary priorities of what you do with your money. And that almost this judgment that comes with it. I remember in Rwanda there was a project, one of the early fair trade coffee projects, and actually they succeeded in the community because they were now earning more money from the coffee crop because they were getting better prices. And what did guys do with the money? 3 new hairdressers. Yeah, 3 hairdressing salons. And I'm like, yes. You know what I mean? Like, because indeed, what's the point of money if you can't enjoy your life? Isn't that the point of money, to enjoy your life? So again, it's this development frame, which is also really over-narrated what African existence is. And to me, I just, like I would say, it's like those things are over there. Let's just do, you know, what we understand to be the things that are important. And, you know, we shape it from there. And so to me, this pleasure thing is really, it is voluptuous and it's ample and it's so varied. And again, there's so many narratives I feel like we've even imbibed for ourselves when we start to define things. And I think, you know, the NGO is sort of the most guilty of that. The way that NGO work, and I know it well because I've worked in that universe for a while, the way that it frames everything is in this narrow conceptualization. So to me, this pleasure thing is really our articulation of aliveness, to use Kevin Kwashi, who I only cited because he was my professor. So as much as he's not an African feminist, he was like, well, he actually wasn't. He didn't teach me. We were in a poetry collective together at my university. But aliveness, right? He writes about black aliveness. And to me, it's that thing of just like, aliveness, right? And channeling that and how we manifest it when we get to define how we want to live.
So all good things come to an end. And it seems like we're almost at the end. But I'm going to sneak and see if there's one. Okay. There are two people who seem to have a question. So the person who's holding the mic better use the mic wisely. And the person, and pass it to the sister behind you with the large fro. And those are the last two comments. Okay, 3 gay.
Working. Okay, it's working now. Wow, thank you so much for this. I just feel so much food flowing and there's lots to finish digesting. I may never finish digesting it, which is fabulous. So thank you very much, Jessica and Dr. Pheko. I think you began to speak to one of the things about the over-reliance on NGOization as an institutional framing of how we practice our feminisms over the years, which is connected to, the donor industrial complexes, and instead of thinking of the money we get as reparation and ours to do what we want with, we get caught up in all the limitations, the absences of voluptuous pleasurabilities that the NGO institutional framing of how we do our feminist politics gets caught up in. So, Jessica, I know you've been part of a lot of those NGOized framings of our feminisms in various forms, from the funding part, from the implementation, from the funds we get and that. And I was like, which ones have you left out here and why? And what have you learnt, if you're to distill now? And we're moving away from the money framing of our doing of our feminist movement politics, but we're still caught up in it so deeply. So I was just wondering, what have you left out about that story and why? What was hard to articulate in this era we're in? We're still very much immersed in that way of doing our feminism. The other thing was this rediscoursing that's happening, and maybe it's affecting praxis as well. So this way of talking about the versions of patriarchies we're facing now, anti-gender, anti-rights, that has a lot to do with geopolitical shifts in how patriarchy is being articulated, far right, global north. I mean, that stuff. What's your take on it? What's that about from your perspective? Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, both of you. That was amazing. I think my question is kind of jumping off what the previous speakers asked. How do we disagree in this moment? Thank you for this book that speaks specifically to African Feminist Praxis, because we are undoubtedly in a severe backlash at the moment, certainly in this country where rights that we fought for are just being rolled back in the scariest way. But you speak about radical hope, but we're living in a time of profound despair. And one of the despairing issues for me right now is, how do we disagree? What are the red lines, Jessica or Dr. Pheko? What are your red lines with respect to feminism right now in this era of backlash, where so many organizations, institutions that feminists have built are being dismantled by phallic women and, these kind of faux feminists? So how do we disagree in this era? How do we call that out without being divisive or destructive to each other? How do we build that kind of radical hope in a time of despair?
Thank you. So I'll be quick. I'm interested in some of the things that were mentioned around who gets to be the knower and what counts as knowledge. And so to Jessica, in particular with
your sources and materials that you cite in your book, did you experience any backlash or any no, that doesn't count as like a source? And what strategies do we use to overcome that? Because often when we find ourselves writing in institutions or writing for publications, etc., our sources and their validity gets questioned a lot of times. So how do we overcome that? And yeah, how did you?
That's it. Is there another hand? I can't see. I truly cannot see. Okay. And you can also. Okay. One for the road. One for
the road.
Ivale, sis.
Okay, I mean, thank you so much. And I think that's part of my comment. I love you both so much, and thank you for this offering. I wanted to hear your reflection, Jessica, on how do we kind of reframe who gets to be the custodian of memory, of tradition, of culture. I mean, in this country we had there's a case of a judge, right, that has brought some of these questions to the fore. And part of my feeling has been this idea that, you know, there are things that are cast in stone somewhat, even though everyone's always saying that, you know, culture is not immovable, immobile. And how do we start to really frame women's resistance as part of African culture, as part of, you know, the tradition? The tradition is that we resist when shit happens. And yeah, man, how do we fight the men who want to use the things only when it's nice for them, right? So they're sitting in suits using a Roman Dutch law practice in particular ways, and yet this one thread now makes him the most African of the African men who have ever African on the continent. Yeah. Thank you.
Go ahead, and maybe you can also use it to wrap your comments, your final comments. Thanks.
Absolutely, and thank you for all of the super juicy questions. On the NGOs and all of that, yeah, I mean it's a bit of a trap. Like, so I ended up in philanthropy very young. I actually fell into a job because I needed one, and that was the beginning of working in private philanthropy. The one reason I found it useful, and at that time I was in my mid-20s, and so my name is Jessica Horn. So I would email people. In those days, the internet wasn't as, you know, active, and images and everything. So I would go to meet a grantee or somebody very senior, and you know, I'd be waiting, and people would be walking past me looking for Jessica Horn. Because I, of course, if I had control over a budget, must have been an old white woman. So, you know, it's been an interesting journey to be in that space. But what I can say is that, in a way, like I said, I have this ecosystemic view. So I actually think that there are contributions made in many different ways. And so I don't completely overwrite the NGO, although I do think it is an industrial complex, and you're right that now, but I think it's going to change because we got to a peak of having a lot of money, and that meant that opportunists entered. And there are many opportunists operating also in philanthropy and in all the spaces where money resides, because it suddenly became lucrative and you could do it without accountability to constituency. And I think that's the key thing. So to me, if an NGO, it's just a format, but if it has accountability to constituency, the work it will do will be a contribution to transformation. If there is no accountability to constituency, then no. And that is what then allows people to run organizations, steal the money or say things, go into places and say things that are completely antithetical to the people in whose name they raised the money. Because you've always got somebody, right, on your website, some photo of some unfortunate, suffering so-and-so on your right. So like you're not in actual relationship with that constituency. You're able to do all of those things and you're unaccountable. So I feel that, I'm curious to see what happens as the money reduces. If it will mean that like the people who are more genuinely in it will remain and the rest will go, or what happens. But I do think there needs to be some thought about that form. It's just a form amongst many. And I think we have to keep imagining various ways of organizing ourselves if that didn't work well. But like I said, it is legitimate to ask questions about practice from institutions that claim that they are working on our behalf. And I think that we should be able to hold institutions accountable in that respect. And then that needs to be, that relationship of accountability needs to be rewoven, because I think it's currently very broken. I also think that our work does need to be resourced, in one way or another. And we resource it already with our creativity, our imagination, our labor, many things that we often give for without in exchange for currency, yeah? But on the currency side of things, I actually think we need to just also rethink that. Because, how can you be sovereign if it's all resourced from elsewhere? So I do think that we also need to be, keep pushing that and really be a lot more creative. And I think that this opportunity of a downturn in certain kinds of donor money offers that. But like I said, there's so many ways that you can work resources that you have. If you have the right intention, one of the women in the women's funding movement, Anna Krikyan, used to talk about it as alchemy. So it's like you receive, like the common rock or stone or whatever from, whatever mainstream source, and you turn it into gold for the movement. So it really depends on how you use it. And I think that it has to be better rooted in accountability to constituency, I think, and then we could see something. On the language, I'm always like in between caring a lot about the words and then recognizing that it's just language in English. And feminisms, for example, have existed on this continent whether or not people are speaking English and calling it feminism per se. And so it's just whether the language that's used makes certain things invisible or not, or who created it. Again, part of the writing was just an attempt, and partly to answer one of the other questions about creating a citational practice. If we keep citing each other, we will also then, our terminology and our language and our ways of thinking will also begin to gain momentum. So again, much like bless, 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 but I did not quote Audre Lorde, right? I did not. The things that we now relying on because they're just there, right? I used an African theorist on Eros, right? Or who actually prefers to speak about Oshunality, drawing on the Yoruba deity of Oshun and understanding what that means there. So if we keep doing that, if we keep referencing, right, we begin also then to draw out our discourse and the way we want to talk about things and our metaphorical universes as broad as they can be, right? Across this continent, we have such a reservoir of imagery and ideas and language and concepts to draw on if we think about the whole continent. So I just think we need to also be more ample in the way we engage it and to cite each other and the ways that and our communities are conceptualizing things and make that into the language that's used, right? So if that, we feel that better defines the terrain. On how we disagree, it's a perpetual problem of humans. I remember I was managing a portfolio of women's rights grant making and LGBT, and I was like, oh, all we do is fight. And I was like, oh my God, what's wrong with us? All we do is fight. And then one of my colleagues in the environmental, he had an environmental portfolio, was like, please, can you go and do some reviews of my grantees because you're going to this country and you can go and meet some of them. Where they were fighting. I was like, oh my gosh. I was like, these guys are even worse. I was like, oh, you know what I mean? So I'm like, it's not only something for us. And so that's just the first point, right? Is that like, we're not the only people that, have these, conflicts internally that feel like they're world ending. I do think that we need greater capacity at things like mediation and finding common ground and finding ways to respectfully hold each other in disagreement. And sometimes we're also just so exhausted and all of that it's hard to summon that. But I think it's helpful to have that. I do think we all have to define our red lines. We have personal ones and we have collective ones, and we have to stick to them. And be very, very clear. I think if we don't, we end up with Women's Day, for example, framed in the way it is, right? Because the red line wasn't drawn clearly enough around how it was acceptable to memorialize this day, right? And so then it became anything. And so we do need to do that. But again, I think, to just think about that. At the same time, I speak in here about the wound within. And so I do talk about internal contention and but also this thing that Hope speaks about of woundology, of also not only anchoring ourselves in the wound. So all we can ever do is, look at the wound and just talk about the wound all the time, right? Because again, if we're trying to engage the horizon, right? Then we have to also be able to shift up, to have some space in our hearts for that too. And so, the pain is deep, and believe, sis, like I carry some deep disappointments, to be sure. But also there's a way that we have to just keep, reconstituting our connection to our why and our commitment. And to also finding people and a commitment to be nicer to each other, I think is also fair. You know what I mean? Like, be a little nicer to each other. Right. In terms of who gets to be the custodian, absolutely. And how to reframe. So I just think, like I said, this citation, not just in books, but literally just constantly referencing this as African, is the one way that we'll get there. So because that's what they did, and that's how they get into a situation where they're able to define everything that's African, and it's narrow like this, and it's in their interests, right? And so how do we keep pushing that? It's interesting in the African regional, in the human rights discourse, originally in the African Protocol on Human and People's Rights, women's rights was only mentioned in the context of the family, right? And women's rights are basically accorded as part of participation in the patriarchal family. So in the Maputo Protocol, right, that feminist lawyers intervened to help draft and create different language, they actually inserted the right to culture and the right for African women to participate in the definition of culture and in the definition of cultural policies. And to me, that's an interesting shift. So I think we absolutely need to claim that capacity, but also to do it. And like I said, to me, citational praxis is key to it. Because what we do then is we begin to build a kind of critical energy and critical mass and movement around certain ideas as being ours, right, as also being African, and we reclaim it. I also think it's really critical to keep creating visual culture, visual culture. We need to make sonic culture, right? We need to just keep doing that, so that we reintegrate, right, our presences and our commitments and our ideas, and re-embrace these things. Pop culture, we have to be mass about it as well, and think about how do we, right? Because that's how you do norm. You change norms. Norms are mass. They're pop, right? Norms are pop, right? They're held by everybody. Pop just means it's of the people, So like, how do we make our things also, right? They are of the people, but how do we, right, really think about that and make it be part of common discourse? So that's super exciting. I see DJs here. I see all kind of people, right? So that's the beautiful work that you do, and I think that we just need to really integrate that. So if you're having, an academic event, DJ is part of the academic conversation, right? And is like literally spinning as the conversation, right? Like we integrate so that we're integrating all of these worlds. So lastly, just on citation, what was pleasurable actually about writing this is that I didn't have that pushback. And I didn't have that pushback because the commissioning editor, Delana Spencer, is a black British feminist who was like, you do you write it the way you need to. And then the peer reviewing editor, Dr. Meredith Clark, is an African-American feminist professor in the States. And she wrote the most beautiful peer review that basically just said, yes, actually, this is thorough, right? It's referenced. It creates a referential universe. that didn't need to actually engage what is considered the canon, which would be African American feminist thought, because it sufficiently builds its own, like, referential universe. So, yeah, but all I'm saying is just do it, push it. And like I said, we need to keep citing each other, because that's the only way, right, we begin to build this momentum around a recognition that the knowledge is what it is, right? It's a presence and it's a contribution as much as anybody else's. So to me, I think that's the way we have to roll, you know? We just have to really cite each other and call each other's names, right? This is our roll call. We have to just keep doing that until it becomes acknowledged as its own brilliant knowledge that, frankly, the rest of the world is missing out on if they're not engaging with it.
So that was beautiful, Jessica.
You too.
I wanna hold this. I want to hold us. I'd like to hold this moment. Liberation is built. It's not simply demanded. It is imagined and co-created. It is sung. It is danced. It is dreamt of as well. It is reclaimed. And thank you for this inspiring reminder on a day such as this of all of this. So I'd like us to do something, ne? We clap with one finger first. Some of us have seen this before. One finger. And it hasn't got much impact, ne? It's like you're not doing anything. Then let's do two fingers. And it's a pitter-patter. It's like a slow build-up. It's like that time when you're walking and you're thinking you're not doing anything, but you do see that you're getting somewhere. Then let's do three fingers and show ourselves that we're actually not just individuals. We're community, we are we. So in the motu, we are becoming an otu. And then the four fingers, that's when we see that there's a sense of community. There's a sense of belonging. There's a sense of camaraderie, and it's not going to go anywhere. And when we do the five fingers, yo! Halala to us. Halala to Sis Jessica. Halala to all the ones who came before, whose names we called out, the ones we know, the ones we don't know, the ones we remember, the ones we unremember, but the ones whom we hold as our ancestors for all time. Thank you. Thank you.